Hi, it's Sebastian Stodolak through Bastiat's eye. Are you aware it's all getting better around us? Well, I know it's hard to believe, but Mr. Johan Norberg, a historian of ideas who is here with us today, can provide you with a lot of data to support this thesis. Mr. Norberg is an author of Progress, a book that is also translated into Polish recently. And this book contains all the essential evidence here. He's, like I said, historian of ideas, but he used to be an anarchist also back in the day. Now he's a classical liberal. That's a very interesting turn of events. Hopefully he will explain that transformation later in our interview. How are you, Mr. Norberg? How are you doing there in Sweden?
Thank you. I'm doing quite well, and I've already had COVID-19 now, so I'm out of it. And I've got some
you're
antibodies.
Already negative. So you've been positive, now you're negative again.
Yes, so I can actually meet people again. So that's nice.
So did you get any symptoms of COVID, or were you maybe asymptomatic case?
I had some symptoms, and the worst and most dramatic symptom was that I lost my sense of smell and tastes. So I actually noticed it when I drank wine, and I realized that it didn't taste anything. So then I took a test, and I got high fever for 2 days and was away from everything for a week or so. But I got out of it rapidly. I didn't suffer the long-term consequences, as I understand many people unfortunately do.
So will you get your vaccination, or now maybe you don't need it?
Well, I don't know how long the antibodies work, so perhaps I should get the vaccination in any case.
Okay, Mr. Norberg, talking of Sweden, your country is like an instant reference for left-wing people. You know, let's do this or that, like they do it in Sweden. And yet, in pandemic, Sweden followed a different fashion than usual. It did not, at least initially, introduce such intrusive lockdown measures as other countries. So how can you explain this strange, surprising phenomenon?
Yes, it is surprising to lots of people, and even to some Swedes, I think. But I think the first thing that everybody has to realize is that Sweden isn't really the old idea of Sweden from the 1970s and 1980s, a semi-socialist country where the government controls everything. We experimented with that for some 20 years in Sweden, and that made us famous around the world. But it was actually a period where we suffered, where the economy suffered. Many of our big companies left Sweden. So companies like IKEA and Tetra Pak, they do not longer stay in Sweden. And we didn't create a single net job in the private sector for some 25 years. And it ended in a crisis. And after that, from the 1990s and onwards, both the left and the right in Sweden has actually liberalized the economy in many ways and opened up and deregulated markets and lowered taxes. So Sweden is not an outlier in a big government way anymore. And I think this response to the pandemic is definitely a sign of that.
So, you know, here in Poland, we called the Swedish approach to pandemic an experiment. So according to what you're saying right now, it actually is an experiment in this respect.
Well, in a way, since we're such an outlier when it comes to policy, Sweden didn't shut down schools, didn't shut down shops, businesses, restaurants. There was mostly social distancing based on recommendation. If you can stay at home and you can work from a distance, please do. If you don't need to use public transportation, please don't use it. And that was the difference. It wasn't under the threat of fines or any government intrusion. But at the same time, I think that many of us Swedes think that if we are an experiment, I think you are an even bigger experiment, and many other countries around the world. We've never seen such a dramatic shutdown in response to a disease before. And many of us think that the long-term consequences of harsh lockdowns and bans on social interaction might have an even higher cost when it comes to not just the economy,
Mhm.
but also health long term, because we need those resources in healthcare. It comes with a mental illness cost. It comes with more domestic abuse when people are forced to stay at home. Children lose school year or something like that. That's also a terrible cost, and it's an experiment.
Yet, to make things clear for liberal-minded people, and I mean liberal in this American sense of the word, Sweden will stay or still stays a symbol of progress because of its generous social policies and high taxes. And what you're saying is that Sweden is like that no more. I mean, it's not a socialist country, right?
That's right, unless you think that all Western welfare states, sort of all European states basically are socialist states, because Sweden is fairly similar to other large European countries when it comes to social spending, like Germany, like lower than in France and Italy and so on. And at the same time, it has more deregulated markets. It has privatized more companies. It has opened up for more free trade, more competition. And so when it comes to on the free market to the socialism spectrum, Sweden is not an outlier anymore. It's a fairly normal country with all the normal problems that a mature welfare state has.
What about the health sector? Is it private? Is it public? Something in between?
It is mostly public and mostly publicly financed, but it's not a central nationalized system like the British system or the French system. It is based on the regions. The local regions are in charge of healthcare, and then it's funded with a local flat tax on incomes, not a progressive tax, which makes a bit of a difference. And it has also, since the 1990s, introduced many private providers in healthcare. One of the biggest hospitals in Stockholm has been privatized, for example, and about a tenth of all Swedes have private healthcare insurance to make sure that they get faster treatment. So in a way, it is more decentralized than a traditional sort of single payer healthcare system, but it's mostly public.
Well, in Poland, we also do have private hospitals, but during pandemic, they seem to back off. I mean, they didn't take part in, treating people with COVID and so on. How is the comparison between those private institutions and public institutions look like in Sweden? Who's better performing under those extraordinary circumstances?
Well, in healthcare, the healthcare system as such, and the hospitals, they are doing a dramatic work to treat COVID-19 patients, except in some instances, and they've been criticized that they haven't opened up more space for particularly COVID-19, but that is when they've actually had contracts with the local regions to treat other patients that needed treatment at the same time. So what has happened is that they have helped the public healthcare system to scale up and to make sure that we don't get a deficit of treatment in other areas as well. And when it comes to things like elderly care, nursing homes for the elderly, we've got both public and private care homes like that. I would say that the result so far is that the private ones were on average much faster in adapting new measures, for example, stopping relatives and friends to come and meet with patients unless they already had a negative test or things like that. So I think they've done really quite well during this crisis.
I've already said that people on the left tend to identify progress with those leftist ideas like high taxes, redistribution, and so on. You do not do it. For you, progress is something else. Can you define it?
Well, progress to me is the ability to do more things tomorrow than we can do today. So it basically means accumulating more knowledge, explore new knowledge, for example, how viruses work, and then to experiment with that, with new technological innovations and business models in various ways. And if you do that a little bit more tomorrow than today, every day over the year, decade after decade, you basically move from the dark ages to the space age, and the ability to come up with a vaccine. You know, it used to take mankind 3,000 years to come up with a vaccine against polio. Now it took Moderna, the healthcare company, 2 days to design the new vaccine against this. And that doesn't come from top down. It doesn't come from command and control. It comes from giving more people the opportunity to search their own solutions to our problems, to look at the local knowledge they have, the individual's needs that they can see, and then experiment. The more experiments we have, the better, because the chance is greater that someone will stumble onto the solution to our problem in the economy, in health, or in the environment.
Well, I introduced you as a former anarchist turned classical liberal. Well, can you please go further into details? How did it happen, this conversion?
Well, I think that the thing that really began to change my mind was studying history, because I had this kind of small-scale local village idea of an anarchist society where we could all live in harmony with one another and live ecologically without big industry, without large-scale organizations of any sort. And then when I studied history, specifically my ancestors' history in northern Sweden, I realized that they didn't live ecologically, they died ecologically, because in the absence of industry, of trade, of large-scale infrastructure, bad weather meant crop failure, meant that they starved to death. Life was incredibly difficult in the absence of modern industrial civilization. And that made me obsessed with the finding out, where does this progress come from? What is it that makes it possible? Because it is brand new. When you look through history, our thousands of years, where for the average person, nothing really happened. Life expectancy stayed at 30%, 30 years. Extreme poverty stayed at around 90%. And then suddenly in the last 200 years, everything changed. And we created these modern and relatively to everything else, comfortable and rich lifestyles. What made that possible? And I realized that at least the version of anarchism that I used to believe in was not the answer.
Well, you often underline this absolute term, these absolute terms when speaking about, progress. So you compare us from the present with people from the past. And of course, we do live much better life than kings in the Middle Ages. But there's this subjectivity when it comes to speak of happiness or to speak of well-being. And of course, we live much better life than our ancestors. But on the other hand, actually, in practice, nobody compares themselves with other people living in the past. We tend to compare us with people living in the current system, in the present. So that's kind of a natural tendency of human nature. And well, that's why those maybe arguments that are based on comparisons with the past events, with the past trends, are not very convincing to a lot of people. So what's your response to this counter argument?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. People don't compare themselves to their ancestors and wake up in the morning thinking, look, I'm so happy because just being alive today means that I'm top 1% in world history, or even in the past 500 years, and that's great. No, you compare yourselves to where you were yesterday, and perhaps to where your neighbors are and where you were before the pandemic. So I've got two responses to that. First of all, I do think that we should compare ourselves to our ancestors more often, because that creates a sense of wonder, I think. Make us realize that this progress is amazing, and we can't take it for granted because this can disappear. And I think that's one of the things that began to happen during the pandemic for lots of people. Suddenly we put global capitalism on hold. We interrupted it for 6 or even 12 months. And the result was immediately global depression, mass unemployment, another almost 100 million people thrown into poverty. And that tells you, I think, that it's possible to slide backwards in history if we make the wrong mistakes. So we should treasure what we've got because it's the way to create more of it. And the other response I've got is that it's true, even if we should sort of wake up in the morning and think a little bit of our place in world history, that won't happen for most people. And that's why we also need continued progress. That's why we can't say that, look, enough is enough. And from now on, we don't need any more growth, innovation, increases in human well-being.
So you are now the supporter of all those zero growth movements, right?
Exactly. I think that zero growth is an incredibly dangerous idea, partly because of basically it means that we won't be able to solve more problems without stopping solving other problems. We won't be able to make it better for some people without making it worse for others. And that means that we create a zero-sum game, and people will begin to see other groups as enemies. And that creates all this nationalism, xenophobia, this search for scapegoats and other things.
Well, but the argument is often that, well, we are already rich. We do not need more cars, more luxuries. We need to focus on the quality of life. And this is the basic argument for the zero growth movement, actually. Why is it wrong? Maybe that's true. Maybe Western European people need to focus on their quality of life, on the quality of air they breathe, the water they drink, the food they eat, not on the producing more products and services.
And I think that's true. And I think that that's what we're doing. I was just about to say, I'm not getting a second car just because we have economic growth, but I even don't have one car. I try to walk and take the bicycle and once in a while a flight. And I think that goes for most people. They don't want to sort of just collect more stuff. That's not really what growth is about. They are taking more concern to see how they can get better stuff. And better stuff means not just something that creates more value in their lives, sort of the smartphone rather than getting maps and alarm clocks and video cameras everywhere. It also means precisely what many ecologists want, less resource use. It means that we don't have to put more ingredients into every dish. It means that we're getting better ingredients that creates a better solution that fits us better and increases our well-being without using more resources. And once in a while, it means that we can do more stuff without working harder. In most European countries, the average working year has been reduced by, the average working hours have been reduced by half since the late 19th century. And that has only been, and that doesn't take into consideration that we start working later in life and we retire earlier with many more years of life later on. And those are the things, the increases in well-being, that would never be possible if we couldn't create more value in every hour, more productivity.
Well, from what you say, I can surely call you an optimist, but politicians and the experts often say, well, optimism is a good thing and market really works, but the dangers, the threats that we are facing these days are such serious things that we cannot base our future only on our optimism and the belief that the market will provide us with the right solutions. We need coordinated usually by the state, coordinated actions to tackle, for example, climate change, because otherwise there will be, or there's a huge risk of it will be a catastrophe for all the humankind. Also, we are facing a threat of nuclear war, so we need to spend more on military to prepare ourselves. We have all those inequalities. We need to redistribute more wealth, because otherwise the social tensions will become such serious that they will destroy democracies. So what is your answer to this kind of approach? Yes, we acknowledge, we assert the strength of markets, but on the other hand, there is a great risk here and there, and we need to address this risk in a well-coordinated manner.
I understand that tendency, definitely, especially when you live or experience you living in a risky environment. And because that's what we used to do on an evolutionary time scale for hundreds of thousands of years. If we faced a risk, it was probably a predator or another tribe attacking us. And then we needed to coordinate our actions. We needed to all sort of surround the predator or the enemy and throw stones, basically. So it's natural that we look to a strong man to protect us, a big government to do it. Nowadays, that's not the case anymore, I wouldn't say, because the problems nowadays are much more complex. The problem today is not an attacking tribe. Once in a while, it is an attacking tribe, and then we need coordinated military action. So I accept that. But most often, it's a complicated problem, like a new virus. We can't just throw stones at it, or it's global warming, which comes from millions of different sources from all around the globe. And then what I would say is that those threats, those risks, and there are other very unforeseen ones, they are too dangerous and too risky to come up with one coordinated response to it. That's much too dangerous, because if that one solution fails, we stand there and exposed to that risk. What we need is a multitude of different responses from lots of millions of individuals and businesses using their local knowledge to come up with a response. So take the pandemic, for example. The first thing that happened was that everybody wanted the government to just solve the problem. Well, what did they do? What did governments do? Well, a government like Poland shut its borders to show that it was strong and could do something. What did that mean? It meant that healthcare workers from the Czech Republic, who normally goes to work across the border in Poland every day to produce protective equipment, they were suddenly blocked, and there was suddenly too few workers who could produce that protective equipment, for example, for Polish healthcare. So it tells you that just looking like a strong man and sort of doing immediate actions could be incredibly dangerous. The thing that solved the problem with protective equipment was the fact that hundreds of companies looked at what they could do locally. So they went from 12 European companies, for example, producing face masks to 500 companies in just 2 months. And they did it because it wasn't coordinated. They did it because they looked, if they were producing clothes or some other manufacturing, they thought, would it be possible for us to switch production to this with the workers we have at our disposal right now who are not off sick? And if we do it, can we avoid doing something else that doesn't create a terrible deficit anywhere else? And only coordination through the price system, which shows that you needed something more, and the local knowledge of those entrepreneurs solve the problem. I think that's the case with global warming as well. If governments try to point to this is the technology that we're going to use to solve the problem, what happens if that's the wrong technology? Because they ended up in the wrong place before. Everybody thought it was sort of corn ethanol would be the solution, or the first generation of nuclear in the 60s, and then heavily subsidizing that particular solution to the detriment of others. I think they should step back. I think they should put a price on carbon so that it costs you something if you pollute, but then with that incentive for everybody to move to greener technology, allow millions of scientists, companies, and consumers to come up with their local way of trying to solve the problems, because millions of brains are smarter than just one or a couple of hundred brains in the government and in parliament.
If I'm not wrong, you recently wrote an article that 2020 was one of the best years in the history of mankind, right?
Yes, That's right. Yeah.
Can you
Yes.
like thoroughly stress the main argument for that?
No, it's one of my most unpopular articles ever. And that's the point, isn't it? Because everybody, including Time magazine, which put it on the cover, said that 2020 was the worst year ever. And I just thought that that was such an incredibly short memory, and wanted again to remind people of the much worse circumstances that our ancestors lived through, and that doesn't help us much, but it tells you something about the progress that we've gone through in just the last few decades. So that even though we had a miserable year in 2020, it was awful. It only took us back in history when it comes to GDP per capita income, extreme poverty, and child mortality around 4 years. So if you look at that data, it was worse than 2017 and 18 and 19, but it was actually a little bit better than 2016. So on objective hard data, it seemed like it was the fourth best year in mankind's history. Take just such an example as child mortality. It was a bad year. We don't have the exact numbers yet on how many children have died because of this, not specifically from COVID-19, but because of the economic collapse, and that results in more hunger and poverty. Well, even if you look at some of the worst scenarios, it still means that 3.5 million fewer children died in 2020 than did die in the year 2000. And that tells you something about how incredibly fast we've managed to solve many of mankind's worst problems during this era. And if we go back to growth and to innovation, I hope we'll be back to the best years ever soon.
So the last question, if it's so good, why nobody appreciate it? You know, probably you are a believer in democracy. You know, democracy tended to gather new followers, new countries during the last decades, but now it seems it is in retreat. Maybe we have a historical level of the number of democracies, but the quality is not very obvious. In some cases, it really declines. Some of the democracies that are nominal democracies are turning quasi-authoritarian countries. Why is it so? Why do people search for alternatives to democracy that seems to work so well? It provided us with such a progress that you described.
Yeah, this is a very worrying development because democracy doesn't just mean that 50% plus one vote can do anything they like against the minority. That's authoritarian democracy. Real liberal democracy means that we all have equal rights and we protect the minorities as well. And we do that through division of powers and checks and balances on the executive powers. But we've seen a backlash against that recently, and I'm not that surprised because it happens quite often in history. Because we have two sides of our nature. We are open, we're good at cooperating and trading with others and creating lots of progress. But at the same time, we are also closed and closed-minded, and often we tend to like cooperation between people who are very similar to us, and we're very worried about how others are, other groups within our society or other countries or migrants. So it's always easy for demagogues to stir up this fear of others. And especially in times of trouble, if you've had economic recessions, if you've had natural disasters or a pandemic, for example, we are all a bit worried. And I think that this rapid news cycle and social media, it speeds up this, it creates more stress hormones. And when we're worried, we look to the strong man for evolutionary reasons, because we did that for hundreds of thousands of years. The strong man, the big government, can you protect us, please? And that temptation is always there, and it always has to be kept in check. And we always have to count to 10 and remind ourselves of history and of economy, how the world does not have to be a zero-sum game where we can only gain on others' expense. If we keep societies open, if we keep markets open, then we can create progress for most groups at the same time. We need that constant educational effort to remind ourselves and to talk to others about that, because the stakes are very, very high.